Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's good to see you again here for our keynote speeches of today. Welcome to the session on urbanization and demographic change. Our two speakers today are Martin Lees and Surinder Agarwal. Also, warm welcome to you. Martin Lees will start our session today with his talk on demographic change and urbanization within the boundaries of a fragile planet. Martin Lees and his influential international positions he held might be already known to some of you, maybe even to many of you, especially through his work at the OECD and later at the Club of Rome. For all the others, I want to briefly introduce him today. Martin Lees is both an engineer on the one side and a social scientist on the other side. He graduated in mechanical engineering from Cambridge University in 1964 and also holds a diploma in European Studies from the College of Europe in Bruges in Belgium. After some years in industry, he joined OECD to manage programs on cooperation in science and technology and on innovation in the procedures and structures of government. In 1972, he was responsible at OECD for the design and launching of the Interfutures project on the future of the advanced industrial societies in harmony with developing countries. He then served at the United Nations as an executive director for the financing system for science and technology for development. And in 1982, he was appointed Assistant Secretary General. During this period, he was responsible for the establishment of an Interaction Council of former heads of state of government. Since 1983, he has managed several advisory programs for the leadership in China, including China and the World in the 90s, and the establishment of the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development. In the first half of the 1990s, he managed programs of cooperation with the then newly independent states of the former Soviet Union, and from 1985 to 2008, he was also moderator of the International Advisory Board of the Toyota Motor Corporation. From 2001 to 2005, he was also rector of the University for Peace of the United Nations in Costa Rica, guiding its revitalization and launching master programs on issues of peace, security, and also sustainable development. From 2008 to 2010, Martin Lees was Secretary General of the Club of Rome. Since then, he speaks and lectures in many parts of the world and is engaged in international projects on climate change, sustainable development, international relations, and also on peace and security. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Martin Lees. Martin Lees, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm exhausted even to hear that trajectory. It is a great honor and a challenge to make a presentation to this distinguished and expert audience. Your Congress is taking place at a time of turmoil and profound change in world affairs, and I have been asked to outline the key global issues of demographic change and urbanization. Before I do this, I think it is useful and important if I first provide a broad context by swiftly reviewing the critical connected issues we face in the modern world. Now, global economic growth has undoubtedly produced enormous benefits for hundreds of millions of people in both developed and developing countries. But we are now heading fast into a perfect storm of connected environmental, economic, and social challenges. The issues confronting the world community today are more intense and threatening than those we have faced in the past. They are on an unprecedented scale with truly global implications. They are evolving fast, and they are essentially connected and systemic, and they will behave individually and together in non-linear ways. We must therefore understand that we face a future not of steady, predictable trends, but of irreducible uncertainty with the risk of discontinuities and of rapid, unpredictable change. On a more positive note, although the Rio+20 conference on sustainable development in June produced very little significant outcome at the intergovernmental level, it did clearly demonstrate that there are vast potentials of creativity, of knowledge, scientific and technological capacity, of accumulated experience, expertise, and resources of all kinds, which could be intelligently deployed to create a more just, stable, and sustainable world. I know that there are a lot of students and young people here, and I would like to say my message today may sound like bad news, but the good news is that we do have the capability to resolve these problems, and that is the tragedy of the human condition, that we are not mobilizing our resources effectively to reduce the risks to your future. The future, in fact, is by no means preordained. It will be determined by our choices and our actions, if, that is, we decide to act in time, but time is running out. The existential challenge we must face is to meet the needs and aspirations of a growing world population in coming decades, while respecting the capacities and boundaries of our fragile planet. Partial incremental change is clearly necessary, but it will not be sufficient to contain our deepening interconnected problems. The time has in fact come for transformational change and for urgent concerted action. The issues of the 21st century are essentially systemic, and they are interconnected. I am therefore particularly pleased to be speaking to a group of expert geographers, because the special contribution of geographers to meet these challenges will be of particular importance. Geography is a scientific discipline, unlike many others, which integrates knowledge and expertise across many fields, from the physical world of resources, energy, climate, and water, and the environment, through the natural world of ecosystems, biodiversity, and agriculture, to the fields of anthropology, sociology, and economics. And in addition, geography also recognizes intrinsically the importance of international and global realities. Your efforts as geographers to develop new intellectual models, to propose coherent policies, and to educate the leaders of the future to manage complex systemic problems will lay the foundations of a better world. Let me now briefly sketch the fundamental challenges of the 21st century which we must overcome if we are to meet human needs and aspirations while preserving a viable environment and a stable climate. I will start by focusing on the crucial but failing relationship between humanity and nature. The escalating scale of human impacts in this Anthropocene age is devastating the environmental and ecological systems on which humanity absolutely depends. According to the Red List of IUCN, nearly 20,000 species of animals and plants around the globe, and that is only of those which we have identified, are at high risk of extinction. We are, in fact, provoking the 6th mass extinction in the past 540 million years. Humanity is overusing the regenerative capacities of the planet by some 50% each year. We are using up our biological capital, not living off our biological revenue, and we are doing this at the cost of future generations, and this is clearly unsustainable. We are also exploiting the energy and physical resources of the planet at an increasingly unsustainable rate. In particular, we are coming to the end of the era of cheap oil, on which our civilization is founded. The fresh water, which is vital to human life and to the ecosystems on which humanity depends, is under increasing stress across the world through overuse, contamination, mismanagement, and climate change. Water use is in fact doubling about every 20 years. The state of the oceans, which support 95% of life on this planet, is also desperate. Human impacts have changed the oceans more in the last 30 years than in previous human history. Mean ocean acidity, which is a crucial problem for the future, has increased by 30% in the last 200 years, and this has severe consequences for both marine life and the global climate. Overall, the current trajectory of world growth and development is in many respects infringing the critical physical boundaries of our fragile planet, as has been made very clear by the impressive research on planetary boundaries led by the Stockholm Environmental Institute. If we continue on a business-as-usual path, the environmental consequences will be devastating. And this becomes very clear when we focus now on the crucial issue of climate change. The world is warming fast, but the preservation of a stable climate is essential if we are to meet the needs of a growing population and to achieve sustainable world development. And the world community has been struggling now for more than 20 years to reach agreement to limit the rise in global average temperature to a target level of 2 degrees Celsius by limiting the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere below 450 parts per million. But even a rise of 2 degrees Celsius would have massive and irreversible consequences, particularly for the poor. And it would have devastating consequences for the terrestrial and ocean ecosystems on which humanity depends. In comparison, let me remind you that the major impacts we already see today across the world are the result of a temperature rise of only 0.8 degrees Celsius since the start of the Industrial Revolution in 1750. Imagine, therefore, the consequences of a rise of even only 2 degrees Celsius. If we fail to act and continue on the present business-as-usual path, global average temperature could rise by over 6 degrees Celsius by 2100. That is above the worst-case scenario of IPCC. Such a rise would provoke intolerable conditions for humanity and for most other living species. And this estimate of 6 degrees is a global average figure. It would imply a temperature rise of double this amount in some regions of the world, such as Greenland and the West Antarctic ice sheets and the Alps. This would provoke a sea level rise which would endanger millions of people in coastal cities. A rise of at least 1 meter by 2100 is almost now inevitable. The melting of the Greenland ice sheet, if and when it should happen, would raise sea level by some 7 meters. This is the consequence you might see in England. Note the absence of London. These then are the realities we face. But as we have seen, international negotiations are failing to agree on strong and timely climate action. Carbon emissions, far from declining, have cumulatively risen by 49% since 1990, reaching a record high in 2011. A recent independent study shows that even if, optimistically, all the reduction targets and pledges which have been made in Copenhagen, in Cancun, and in Durban, even if these were implemented, we would still be on a path to an average temperature rise of between 3.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius, which of course would bring terrible consequences. Now, all of this is bad enough, but there is another dimension to this problem. We also face the grave risk that we may push the climate beyond some tipping points, which can trigger a number of positive feedback processes. These could generate runaway climate change beyond our influence. As we fail to act, and as the planet warms, these feedback processes are beginning to operate. This is a grave threat to the future of us all. It would seem obvious that strong precautionary climate action must be taken within the next crucial decade to avert such risks. But the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, as it's called, envisages a new international agreement to be established only in 2015, with a commitment to binding emission cuts after 2020. This is too little and too late. In reality, ladies and gentlemen, there is no choice between development or emissions reduction to avert the risks of climate change. Development and environment must be integrated within one coherent strategy, and this is now increasingly understood, for example, in China, which, as you heard, established 20 years ago the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development together. The scale and urgency of the climate challenge is set out clearly in a recent statement called Action to Face the Realities of Climate Change, which was presented at Rio+20 by a task force convened by President Gorbachev within the framework of an organization called Green Cross International. That is our environmental accounting. Let us look now at the social challenges we face. Besides its devastating impacts on the natural world, our present path of growth is generating major social imbalances and injustices. Inequality in wealth and income is rising, while the number of people living in abject poverty is again increasing. According to the World Bank, some 1.3 billion people are trapped in poverty, while around 2 billion people are living on less than $2 per day, with their basic needs for security, employment, health, food, and nutrition unmet. The escalating demand of a world population linked to increasing prices for food and energy has already provoked a food crisis across the world, and the livelihoods of the poor The livelihoods of the poor are under threat from food and energy insecurity and from widening water stress, desertification, and intensifying extreme weather events. Besides these intensifying environmental and social issues, we are living also at a time of crisis in world economic and financial affairs, as we all know, with growing imbalances, instability, and vulnerabilities. And the processes of globalization have been widening the gaps between rich and poor. 2% of the richest people own around 50% of the world's wealth, while the poorer 50% own only 4% of the world's wealth. Further, the balance of economic power and influence across the world is changing at a pace which was unanticipated only a few years ago, with the rise of powerful new economic actors, notably the major emerging economies of the global south. One indicator of this profound change is that China now has foreign currency reserves well over $3 trillion. So in these circumstances, ladies and gentlemen, what is our strategy to deal with these crucial challenges which I have outlined? Well, we remain committed to a strategy which believes that our deepening economic, financial, and social problems, and ultimately the problems of environment and poverty, can be resolved by stimulating demand for further consumption so as to return as soon as possible to the established path of exponential economic growth as measured by GDP. This strategy presumes that the world economy can double in size by 2030 and that it can then double again by 2050, Simple arithmetic tells you that this would imply that 3 new world economies would be added to today's world economy in less than 40 years, driven by the needs of a growing world population and a rising world middle class. While this established strategy may appear logical and feasible to policymakers preoccupied with acute financial and economic issues, it is clearly not feasible and not sustainable when we consider the realities of climate, environment, energy and resources, demographic change, inequality and development. For example, according to IPCC, under this scenario, passenger vehicles would increase across the world from 600 million today to 1.7 billion in 2050. Of course, most of these would be heavily concentrated in congested cities. We are, in effect, at a turning point in thinking, strategy, and international cooperation. We must first accept that our present models and strategies for economic growth are failing in critical respects. We can then define and implement a new path for inclusive, equitable, and sustainable world development, recognizing the systemic nature of the challenges we face, and this is essential if we are to meet human needs within the limits of a finite planet. This would not only reduce the risks and threats now emerging, but would bring enormous opportunities and co-benefits, laying the foundations of the innovative, resource-efficient, inclusive economies and societies of the future. To map out such a new path for world development is now a focus of the program of the Club of Rome. Following that overview of world problems, let me now move directly to demographic change and urbanization. First, demographic change. Within this perspective, I will now outline the key aspects of demographic change. First, the question of the absolute numbers of people, then the spatial distribution of population, and then the changing age structure of population and its implications. Over the past 50 years, world population has more than doubled from 3 billion in 1960 to 7 billion today. The total size of world population is likely to increase further to between a low estimate of 8 billion and a high estimate of 10 billion or more by 2050. Clearly, the prospects for sustainable world development, for a stable climate, and for world peace would vastly improve if the outcome is nearer to 8 billion than to 10.5 billion. This wide range of possible outcomes is due, of course, to the uncertainties of future fertility and mortality trends in different parts of the world. In 2011, the median projection of the UN Population Division, which had been around 9.15 billion for 2050, was revised upwards, reflecting the fact that fertility rates, principally in Africa, are not diminishing as expected. We face, in fact, a demographically divided world. Population size in most of Eastern Europe, in Russia and Japan, and in Western Europe, apart from migration, is in decline. In contrast, populations in sub-Saharan Africa and some Asian countries are still set to double or to triple in size. China's population will continue to grow for 2 decades before entering a decline, while India is headed for a population increase of between 300 and 400 million by 2050. The size of the US population is also increasing due both to internal growth and immigration. Nearly all of the growth in world population will occur in developing countries, but within this broad statement, there are major differences. The transition has been quite fast in some countries where fertility has declined substantially in just 3 decades. In around 37 developing countries, fertility is now below replacement levels. But in some 20 or more least developed countries, fertility rates remain stalled at average levels of 5 or above, with many others between 4 and 5, In Niger, for example, the fertility rate remains stuck at around 7. The implications of such high fertility rates are ominous. The population of sub-Saharan Africa, which was around 611 million in 2000, is now around 800 million. It is expected to grow to around 1 billion over the coming decade and to around 1.6 billion by 2050. Another telling example is Afghanistan, with a population of 28 million today, which is set to rise to 45 million by 2025 and around 75 million by 2050. So from 28 to 75 million. The security implications alone of such an evolution are of immense concern. Putting such figures in the wider framework which I described to you first, the Center for Global Development in the US in a recent study concluded that climate change impacts during this same period of rapid population growth could result in a fall in food production in Africa by around 28% by 2050. Where will Nigeria be on the present path when its population will have risen to almost 300 million people? A further factor of increasing importance will be the migration of refugees within and between countries, driven by sea level rise, destructive storms and extreme weather events, by expanding deserts, rising levels of pollution, degrading soils and ecological support systems, by the lack of jobs and opportunity, and by insecurity and violence. In many regions of the world, the flood of people into cities is driven by such pressures. Let me now turn to the age structure of population. Besides the consequences of absolute increases in the numbers of people, a critical aspect for the future is the changing age structure in different countries. In broad terms, the industrialized countries of Europe, North America, and Northeast Asia, including China after 2030, will face the consequences of demographic aging, affecting labor markets, health care costs, public finance, and economic performance. As phrased by Vice President Wu Yaoshou of the China National Committee on Aging, he said, "Population ages fast and the numbers are enormous. The elderly population made up 5% of the total in 1982 and 10% in 1999, and it increases by 100 million every 10 years. That's the scale of the Chinese problem. In contrast, countries in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia will face the intense problems of providing employment, education, healthcare, and opportunity to meet the needs and aspirations of rapidly growing youthful populations. A tide of young people is entering labor markets in search of productive employment. There are at present worldwide around 1.2 billion young men and women between the ages of 15 and 24, 1.2 billion, with many more to come. In sub-Saharan Africa alone, this group will increase from 170 million to 360 million by mid-century. The growth of world population will, of course, put added pressure on the natural capital and ecosystems of our planet and on the economic, social, and political fabric of our societies. On the other hand, if additional people have the opportunity to live healthy, fulfilled lives, this will add to the human capital of creativity and productive work to improve the world. This is therefore a key policy opportunity. As stated in 1992 at UNCED in the Rio Declaration, human beings are at the center of concern for sustainable development. So in these circumstances, ladies and gentlemen, what should be the priorities for policy and action? I would suggest 4. Unfortunately, feasible policies are available to influence the trajectory of demographic growth, and they can deliver relatively rapid results. First of all, it will be necessary to provide basic health services for all, and in particular, to ensure universal access to voluntary programs of reproductive health and family planning. At present, some 215 million women have no such access to family planning, 59% of these in sub-Saharan Africa. Together with their families, they represent around 1 billion people. Secondly, sustained efforts to provide education and empowerment, particularly of girls and women, has been shown to be even more effective in reducing fertility rates than rising income alone. Thirdly, the eradication of poverty is obviously critical. Many examples demonstrate that rising incomes contribute to lower fertility rates. And fourthly and finally, explicit sustained efforts must be focused on the creation of productive employment, which is crucial to reducing poverty and hunger, to building productive economies, and to preserving social cohesion, effective governance, and stability. These policies and measures taken together for health, education, poverty reduction, and employment would be mutually reinforcing within a coherent strategy for sustainable and inclusive human development. They would together strengthen the human capital, which is the foundation of progress, and they would influence the trajectory of demographic growth so as to stabilize world population between 8 and 9 billion people rather than between 10 and 11 billion by 2050. Turning now to urbanization, let me sketch the scale, the speed, the risks, and the implications of the rapid urbanization of our species. The proportion of world population living in cities has risen from around 10% in 1900 to over 50% today. If present trends continue, this proportion will rise to over 70% by 2050. The implications, of course, are enormous. The McKinsey Global Institute has calculated that between 2010 and 2030, the world's 600 largest cities will contribute around 65% to global growth, and that they will require 10 trillion in additional annual investments by 2025. This would imply the construction of additional floor space equivalent to 85% of all today's residential and commercial building stock, with immense implications for land use and the environment. To meet this scale of urban demand, the supply of fresh water will have to increase by some 80 billion cubic meters per year, a rise of 40% above today's total urban demand. It is clearly of the highest importance that this process of urbanization should be undertaken in the most resource-efficient and least environmentally damaging way. In China, for example, where the rate of urbanization is most rapid, nearly half the world's new floor space is built each year. Putting up and using buildings accounts for around 30% of China's climate change emissions. According to the International Energy Agency, cities are likely to account for over 70% of global fossil fuel-based climate emissions by 2030. A key domestic and international priority must therefore be to extend access to modern energy-efficient technologies so as to avoid the lock-in of inefficient technologies for buildings, transport, and infrastructure. If efficient technologies can be deployed, this will reduce energy use and emissions for decades to come, and thus the risks of climate change. As energy systems in many cases are inefficient, energy intensity can be reduced significantly through sustained policies, as this diagram shows. The growth of cities throughout history has been driven by the aspirations of people to find better jobs and opportunities, better access to education, health, and culture. But there is wide diversity in the circumstances and conditions of cities. Immigration into many cities of the developing world today is driven less by hope of a better future and more by the breakdown of rural livelihoods brought about by many factors. As population increases and environmental constraints tighten, the flow of migrants into cities will increase, intensifying the challenges of rapid urbanization. Cities are immensely complex systems, dependent on their hinterlands, their regions, and their nations. They rely on the functioning of supporting systems to provide energy, water, food, waste disposal, transport, and so on. In the coming world of rapid change, economic instability, and environmental risks and constraints, cities are therefore increasingly vulnerable to trends, disruptions, and shocks beyond their control. We should not therefore automatically assume that the present rapid trend towards urbanization is inevitable and sustainable in the longer term. It will be a key challenge to city administrations, to governments, and to the world community at large to ensure that this rapid trend towards urbanization can be undertaken to contribute to a sustainable and peaceful world. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me now conclude by saying what you as geographers can contribute at this critical time in world affairs. First of all, I believe that geographers are well placed to make a number of contributions along the following lines. In the field of research, geographers can contribute to the elaboration of the new paradigms and indicators of growth and development which can improve coherence between the physical, environmental, economic, social, and human facets, which must become mutually reinforcing to achieve sound and sustainable development. Secondly, geographers can help to develop the application of systems thinking to understand better the connected nature of the challenges we face. This would improve the results of intervention, it would strengthen resilience and the anticipation of shocks, and provide a sound basis for the management of risk under uncertainty. In all of this, education is a key factor in every respect. Curricula and methodology must be adapted to create a new generation of leaders, experts, and practitioners with the knowledge and skills to understand and manage the complex issues of the modern world. Also, the general public must be made aware of the reality of the challenges we face if they are to support the essential changes. Finally, the interface between science and policy is of central importance. At present, the insights and knowledge of science are not properly reflected in the design of policy, particularly in relation to ecosystems degradation and climate change. Policymakers must come to understand the reality and urgency of the threats to the future. Geographers can play a valuable role in developing coherent, longer-term perspectives of the challenges and opportunities ahead, and as concerned citizens, explaining and pressing for the urgently needed action. I hope that this brief review of global prospects for demographic change and urbanization on our fragile planet will provide a useful contribution to your further discussions. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this extremely exciting and challenging event, and I wish the Congress every success as it proceeds. Thank you very much.